Tonight's main news, police and councils on this side of the channel have appealed for extra help, saying they're struggling to deal with the impact of the Calais migrant crisis. So what should be done? With me now, the Conservative MEP, Daniel Hannan, and the Policy Director for the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, Sarah Grant. Daniel Hannan, the Prime Minister has talked about a swarm of people coming across the Mediterranean. Isn't there a danger that it's dehumanising the thing and that we've actually got a very real individual human crisis?
I mean, I think that's a displacement activity to focus on the language rather than the issue.
It might display a mindset.
Well, I mean, has a Channel 4 news reporter ever talked about, say, protesters swarming into a building? It means big numbers, which is the issue. Of course, these are all human beings. You know, we don't need to be... Everyone accepts that. And of course, we've all seen the tragedies. And the question is, how do you prevent future tragedies of the kind that we've seen in the Mediterranean, you know, children being brought over, suffering from drowning? And it seems to me that must depend on making the act of getting into Europe a less secure route. We have to find a way of returning people to their port of origin so that they are no longer tempted into making these hellish journeys.
That will require a Europe that works.
Well, it requires a change in EU rules in two ways. First of all, the border-free zone within Europe. And secondly, this idea that as soon as you're outside Libyan waters, as soon as you get into international waters, you'll be landed in Italy. Because as long as we do that, instead of admitting the people who have queued up and played by the rules and waited their turn, or the people who have been judged to be in the greatest need by the UN, we are contracting out our immigration policy to these gangsters in Tripoli.
So, Sarah Grant, it's easy. We just send the ones that don't qualify back.
It's not easy at all, but can I pick up on the language? Because I think language does matter. And whilst we have to talk about the substantive issue, using language so loosely that does dehumanise people is actually really irresponsible, because the average person interprets the word swarm as a pejorative term. And I think it is really unbefitting a Prime Minister to use such terminology, because in my work, we have been fighting the sort of toxic language that surrounds immigration, and this does nothing to contribute.
So what would you do?
If the solution was that simple and we could work it out tonight, that would be wonderful. The solution isn't simple, but there are two things here that we've got to remember. We are talking about a global refugee crisis, a humanitarian crisis of the sort we've not seen since the Second World War. So there is no simple solution. There are 60 million displaced people globally, and there are 20 million refugees. 86% of those people are not here. They are in developing countries.
Well, the French ambassador said that at the end of the year, European leaders are going to meet to discuss this. I mean, what's going to happen in between?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to distinguish between people who are refugees and people who are migrants. I agree there is a refugee crisis. I was working in a Syrian refugee camp last year. There is no question that there are people who are suffering and are in need. But France is not a country where you have a well-founded fear of persecution. Someone in Calais is not, by any normal definition, a refugee or someone...
So should we be receiving any? Should we be...
From France, no. I don't see why someone is that desperate to get out of France. If you're a refugee, your aim is to get out of a particular country, not to get into a particular country.
That's a good point. But for a lot of people, I mean, what you're talking about is the Dublin Convention. The first safe country you come to, if you're a refugee, you ought to seek asylum there. But remember, we are an island. You know, there is no direct route to the UK. If people crossing the Med, they have to come via Europe, but it's the first reasonable and practicable opportunity. So for a lot of people, they come to the UK because they actually have ties here, they have families here. I was just watching a report earlier today about a young Afghani who's there, stuck there, whose wife and child are here. So he doesn't want to claim asylum in France. He wants to be reunited with his family here.
Briefly, family ties?
We have procedures. I'm not someone who says we should have zero immigration. I'm saying you should allow the people who have followed the rules, or you should take a certain number where there is a crisis, like in Syria, who have been designated by the UN as refugees. You cannot start allowing people to jump the queue simply because they have behaved in a more criminal fashion.
Daniel Hannan, Sarah Grant, I'm sorry. As ever, we don't have enough time to discuss something rather important. Thank you. Jackie.
Good night.